The Great Declaration of Moral and Political Independence of the Sovereign Persons of Cascadia. And of all free peoples who choose to stand with them. Part 1. When, in the course of human events, the inheritance of liberty is placed in jeopardy not by foreign monarchs but by domestic institutions grown unrestrained, when the very safeguards erected by ancestors to secure the blessings of liberty become instruments of subordination and the tools of those who seek dominion rather than stewardship, a people, conscious of their dignity and guided by reason, must examine the causes and conditions which impel them to reclaim their sovereignty. We, the sovereign persons of Cascadia and all others aligned with the doctrine of individual dignity, distributive justice, ecological fidelity, and republican self-governance, find ourselves compelled by conscience and necessity to declare a moral and political independence from the structures that have long ceased to reflect the will, welfare, or wisdom of the people. We do so neither out of caprice nor momentary dissatisfaction but as the culmination of decades of accumulated injuries, usurpations, corruptions, and systemic betrayals which jointly evince a deliberate design to reduce the individual to dependency, the community to servitude, and the nation to a hollow vessel animated not by the people's consent but by the ambitions of oligarchs, bureaucrats, and technocrats who neither respect liberty nor comprehend the duties that accompany legitimate sovereignty. Human freedom is not granted by governments, it derives from the natural condition of sapient existence. Every person, by virtue of consciousness and moral agency, possesses unalienable rights, among which are life and health, liberty, autonomy, and self-determination, privacy and property, self-security and self-defense, and the pursuit of happiness. These rights pre-exist all constitutions, all states, and all compacts. They cannot be surrendered, sold, rescinded, or redefined by statute, decree, or judicial invention. They may be violated, but they cannot be annulled. The original Declaration of Independence in 1776, authored in an age of empire, proclaimed that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Yet in our age, the language of consent has been distorted to mean assent to systems that neither reveal their operations nor accept accountability for their failures. The modern state presumes consent where none is given, assumes legitimacy where none is recognized, and seeks obedience where fidelity cannot be earned. We, the inheritors of Cascadia's constitutional doctrine and the successors to the radical republican tradition, affirm not only the right but the duty to withdraw consent when the governing order ceases to protect the rights it was created to secure. Such withdrawal is neither rebellion nor sedition, it is the lawful reassertion of natural political authority where institutions have failed their mandate. As Ghost Liberty has articulated, sovereignty begins not in capitals or courts but in the individual. As Cypher Kai teaches, governance without transparency is domination masquerading as order. And as the long-standing tradition of distributist and progressive libertarian thought attests, a society cannot thrive where power is centralized, wealth is hoarded, and communities are deprived of the economic, political, and ecological means to sustain themselves. Thus we declare, solemnly and deliberately, that the time has come to articulate our grievances, our principles, and our claim to moral and political independence. We do not take this step lightly. Prudence indeed dictates that governments long established should not be changed for transient or insubstantial causes, and that individuals are often inclined to suffer while evils are sufferable rather than expose themselves to the hardships inherent in transformation. But when a long train of abuses, extending across generations and institutions, reveals a coherent design to subject the people to arbitrary authority, the duty to restore liberty becomes unavoidable. The grievances herein detailed represent not isolated missteps but a structural pattern of coercion, deception, and dereliction that can no longer be tolerated. The people have petitioned, protested, litigated, and remonstrated, only to be met with disdain, surveillance, misrepresentation, retaliation, and further injury. That the apparatus of governance is now wielded as a shield for the powerful and a lash against the ordinary is evident by the plain facts of experience. We therefore proceed to lay these facts before the world. The institutions that claim to govern in our name, federal, state, and increasingly local, have forsaken their essential purpose. They have abandoned their constitutional limitations, violated their oaths, and transformed systems of representation into mechanisms of subordination. They have substituted law with edict, justice with expediency, accountability with secrecy, and the common good with the interests of private elites who neither labor nor sacrifice alongside the people but profit from their subjection. They have erected bureaucracies so vast and opaque that no citizen may understand the rules by which they are governed, and yet all are threatened with sanction, ruin, or imprisonment should they fail to comply. They have turned the law into a maze through which only the wealthy, the protected, or the politically connected may safely pass. They have weaponized surveillance technologies to monitor the daily lives of the populace, tracking speech, movement, association, commerce, research, communication, and belief, under the pretense of security but in truth to cultivate obedience and neutralize dissent. They have monitored what books we read, what ideas we consider, what private conversations we conduct, and what lawful pursuits we enjoy, all in violation of the Fourth Amendment's clear prohibitions and the natural right to privacy. They have embraced powers unknown to the founders, powers they wield not sparingly, in times of war or emergency, but as routine instruments of political order. They detain without charge, censor without transparency, surveil without warrant, seize property without due process, and regulate the most intimate spheres of personal conduct without justification grounded in rights or justice. They have targeted whistleblowers, journalists, dissidents, community leaders, and political outsiders, not to preserve order but to preserve their own authority. They have prosecuted individuals not for harming others, but for exposing the harms committed by the state itself. They have refused to limit themselves by the plain text of the Constitution, instead distorting its meaning through judicial invention, executive reinterpretation, and legislative abdication. They permit rights to be hollowed by regulatory decree. They allow the First Amendment to be undercut by surveillance, the second by prohibition, the fourth by digital intrusion, the fifth by administrative coercion, the sixth by prosecutorial bargaining, the ninth by judicial neglect, and the 10th by federal overreach. They have eroded the doctrine of federalism, not to protect rights, but to centralize authority. They have transformed a federated republic into a consolidated administrative empire, in which state and local autonomy exist only at the pleasure of federal agencies whose uniforms and acronyms vary but whose power remains uniform in its disregard for liberty. They have used economic systems not as engines of opportunity but as instruments of extraction. They have allowed private banking cartels, nominally independent but functionally unaccountable, to dominate the lifeblood of the economy. They have permitted fiat currency to be conjured into existence by private hands, indebting citizens across generations while enriching the financial elite whose influence permeates governance at every level. They have sanctioned inflation as a concealed tax and debt as a generational shackle. They have created a system wherein the people work months of each year not for their families or communities but for the enrichment of private financial empires and the satisfaction of interest payments owed to institutions that produce nothing but obligation. They have replaced distributive justice with corporate feudalism. They have constructed an economic order in which the small farmer, independent worker, artisan, tradesperson, and local entrepreneur cannot compete with transnational entities that enjoy subsidies, exemptions, bailouts, and privileges denied to ordinary citizens. They have allowed corporations to write legislation, agencies to execute it, and courts to reinterpret it, all to the benefit of those who invest not in communities but in political compliance. They have undermined ecological stability in pursuit of industrial expansion devoid of constraint, failing to recognize that a free society must also be a living one, harmonized with the land that sustains it. They have sanctioned environmental degradation, extraction without replenishment, and development without accountability. They have ignored the biooriginal wisdom that Cascadia has championed, that governance must arise from, and remain accountable to, the ecological realities of place. They have criminalized self-reliance and undermined the people's capacity for independence. They have restricted homesteading, farming, rainwater collection, small-scale energy production, land stewardship, and community resource pooling. They have substituted mutual aid with bureaucratic dependence, and voluntary cooperation with mandatory compliance. They have infringed upon the natural right to keep and bear arms, an essential safeguard of liberty, security, and personal sovereignty. They have criminalized the possession of tools of defense. They have prohibited the exercise of self-defense. They have transformed innocuous acts into felonies merely because they involve firearms. They have maintained registries incompatible with privacy and safety. They have imposed regulations incompatible with natural rights, and they have sought repeatedly to disarm the populace while arming the state to levels incompatible with a free society. They have deployed militarized police and federal agents among us, not to protect communities but to intimidate them. They have permitted raids conducted without necessity, checkpoints established without lawful warrant, and surveillance towers erected without consent. They have maintained a standing domestic army in direct violation of the spirit of the Third Amendment and the Republican tradition. They have invited foreign interference and domestic division to consolidate their own power. They have manipulated immigration policy not to welcome newcomers into liberty, but to destabilize communities, foment conflict, and engineer electoral outcomes. They have provoked civil unrest through agent provocateurs, covert operations, and psychological manipulation, all while presenting themselves as the cure for the chaos they manufacture. They have manipulated information through corporate media, digital platforms, and intelligence agencies. They have censored viewpoints, distorted narratives, and denied the people the ability to form judgments based on truth rather than propaganda. They have used euphemism, rhetorical obfuscation, and emotional manipulation to advance policies that, if described plainly, would provoke universal opposition. They have experimented upon the populace through covert programs, psychological, chemical, biological, and electromagnetic, without consent, transparency, or accountability. They have violated the Nuremberg Code, betrayed the principles of informed consent, and concealed evidence of harm. They have pursued strategies to monopolize knowledge, control innovation, and prevent the emergence of new political, economic, and technological systems that might empower the people. They have worked to suppress open-source technologies, decentralized communication networks, privacy-preserving tools, and alternative economic models, recognizing that a populace capable of self-organization cannot be easily controlled. They have obstructed the creation of new communities and new nations by stifling movements like Cascadia that seek peaceful independence, ecological stewardship, and distributive justice. They fear that new examples of free governance will reveal the failures of the old, and so they prevent their formation. They have exposed citizens to the dangers of globalist ambitions and transnational collusion. They have colluded with international oligarchies whose interests lie not in the flourishing of communities but in the consolidation of planetary control, economic, informational, technological, and political. They have pursued arrangements that bind nations not through cooperation but through dependency, yielding sovereignty to entities unaccountable to any people. They have mocked the rule of law, weaponizing it against ordinary citizens while shielding the powerful from accountability. They have detained the innocent while protecting the guilty, punished the whistleblower while concealing the crimes exposed, and treated justice as a commodity available only to those who can afford it. They have ignited wars on false premises, sacrificed lives for geopolitical stratagems, and justified acts of aggression in the name of security while delivering only insecurity, instability, and grief. They have fought not for the people but for the interests of the elite, for the enrichment of defense contractors, and for the expansion of state power. They have refused to redress grievances, no matter how humbly or repeatedly presented. Petitions are dismissed as extremism, hearings are reduced to performance, investigations are delayed or corrupted, and those who seek accountability are labeled dissidents, radicals, or enemies. They have altered the forms of government without the consent of the governed. They have bypassed legislatures through executive orders, bypassed courts through administrative law, bypassed representation through regulatory fiat, and bypassed democracy through secrecy, coercion, and manipulation. They have rendered the electoral system untrustworthy, susceptible to fraud, distortion, and undue influence. They have allowed financial interests and media conglomerates to control the conditions of political participation. They have transformed elections from expressions of civic will into spectacles of managed perception. They have debased the educational process, converting schools from institutions of learning into centers of indoctrination. They have undermined critical thinking, civic literacy, and intellectual independence, replacing education with ideological conformity. They have corrupted the administration of justice by permitting prosecutorial overreach, judicial bias, plea bargaining coercion, and the criminalization of conduct that harms no one. They have expanded the carceral state beyond all reason, transforming justice into industry and citizens into commodities. They have failed to steward the land, water, air, and ecosystems entrusted to their care. They have allowed corporate extraction to ravage forests, degrade rivers, pollute coastlines, and destabilize climates, all while stifling local efforts to restore balance. They have tolerated homelessness, poverty, addiction, and despair while enriching those who profit from these conditions. They have criminalized mutual aid and punished community solidarity. They have allowed unrestrained property speculation to drive families from their homes and destroy the fabric of communities. They have done all these things, and more not here enumerated, but always with the same purpose: to erode individual sovereignty, weaken communal solidarity, destroy distributive justice, centralize power, and preserve their own authority at the expense of the people. Therefore, observing with sober judgment and unbroken resolve that the present systems of governance have become destructive of the ends for which governments are instituted, and recognizing that the people are the ultimate guardians of their own liberty, we declare ourselves morally and politically independent of the authority that no longer represents us. And so, in full possession of our reason, our dignity, and our natural political authority, we bring forth the following declaration, not as supplicants seeking permission, nor as rebels seeking disorder, but as a free people reclaiming the rights that pre-exist all governments, are superior to all statutes, and are inseparable from the condition of human sovereignty. Let the history of the present governing order be laid bare, for it reveals a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object: to concentrate power in distant institutions, to render the individual dependent, to hollow the commons, to rule communities through fear, and to extinguish the possibility of a free and flourishing humanity. And let it be said plainly, these institutions did not fail inadvertently. Their failures are the predictable consequence of an ideology that worships centralization, elevates bureaucracy above community, prioritizes corporate profit over distributive justice, and mistakes surveillance for security. The crisis we face is not of policy but of principle, not of mismanagement but of systemic design. We therefore continue to lay out the full measure of our grievances, so that they may stand as testimony before the world and warning to future generations. They have undermined the sovereignty of the individual, presuming to define our identities, our rights, our health, our associations, and even our beliefs. They have claimed jurisdiction over our bodies, asserting power to compel medical interventions, restrict bodily autonomy, and impose programs without informed consent. They have treated the person not as a being of inherent dignity but as property of the state. They have violated the sanctity of the home, entering without true warrants, seizing property without proper judicial process, and surveilling domestic spaces through digital devices. They have maintained the fiction that a warrantless digital search is not a search, and that privacy is a privilege to be revoked, not a right to be defended. They have corrupted the courts, transforming them from forums of justice into theaters of procedural manipulation. Judges defer to bureaucracies without scrutiny, prosecutors threaten defendants with catastrophic sentences to compel pleas, agencies act as judge, jury, and executioner under the guise of administrative law, and citizens are deprived of the protections guaranteed by centuries of common law principle. They have imposed taxation without true representation, demanding tribute not for the welfare of communities but to feed bureaucracies and pay interest on debts the people never approved. They have levied taxes through inflation, fees, fines, civil forfeiture, and regulatory penalties, many designed not to fund public goods but to discipline the populace. They have eroded the press, concentrating media in the hands of a few conglomerates that regurgitate the narratives of the state and suppress dissident voices. They have permitted governments and corporations to collude in censorship, erasing speech not for falsehood but for disobedience. They have suppressed open debate and weaponized misinformation as a justification for controlling the public mind. They have criminalized moral and economic independence, punishing those who seek to live off the land, who build alternative communities, who grow their own food, who develop local currencies, who homeschool their children, who share resources, or who build parallel institutions. They fear self-reliant citizens because such citizens cannot be controlled. They have encouraged the erosion of family and community bonds, not through malice alone but through policies that disincentivize mutual support and reward fragmentation. They have replaced local wisdom with distant expertise, replaced community resolution with bureaucratic intervention, and replaced the organic social fabric with dependency on centralized authority. They have abandoned the youth, stripping education of meaning, burdening generations with debt, drowning them in propaganda, and denying them the tools to build a stable life. They have offered young people a future of surveillance, precarity, and shrinking opportunity while demanding their allegiance to institutions that offer them nothing in return. They have manipulated crises, economic, medical, ecological, technological, to expand power, suspend rights, and justify unprecedented intrusions into private life. They have declared emergencies not to solve problems but to seize authority. They create perpetual crises because a frightened populace is more easily managed. They have permitted the militarization of the homeland, deploying armored vehicles, surveillance aircraft, predictive policing algorithms, and tactical squads against citizens under the guise of safety. They have normalized the presence of militarized agents in schools, neighborhoods, and public spaces. They have enforced laws selectively, punishing the politically unfavored while protecting cronies, donors, and allies. The law has become not a shield of liberty but a weapon of faction, wielded to empower the connected and silence the dissenting. They have eroded the consent of the governed, designing electoral systems that offer the illusion of choice but not its substance. They exclude independent voices, restrict ballot access, manipulate district boundaries, drown candidates in dark money, and ensure that only those loyal to the existing order can ascend to positions of influence. They have broken the covenant of federalism, absorbing powers reserved to the states and the people. They have imposed uniform mandates upon diverse regions with distinct cultures, economies, ecologies, and aspirations. They have rejected the principle that governance must be as local as possible and as distant as necessary. They have reduced the people to data points, collecting biometric information, genetic material, financial transactions, travel records, private correspondence, educational histories, and behavioral analytics. They have created databases of unimaginable scope, governed by no true oversight, accessible to unaccountable agencies, and vulnerable to misuse. They have abused science, funding only that which serves political interests, suppressing findings that contradict official narratives, and weaponizing expertise to delegitimize dissent. They have transformed institutions of discovery into instruments of political conformity. They have perpetuated endless war, spilling blood and treasure for conflicts that serve no moral or strategic purpose. They have sacrificed countless lives, destabilized entire regions, and mortgaged the future for wars fought not for defense but for empire. They have exploited the natural world, tolerating and enabling ecological degradation while punishing citizens who attempt to steward land responsibly. They have privatized the commons, destroyed habitats, polluted rivers, collapsed fisheries, and devastated forests, all in the name of economic growth devoid of ecological wisdom. They have suppressed indigenous sovereignty, ignoring treaty rights, appropriating cultural heritage, destroying sacred sites, and exploiting resources extracted from lands never ceded. They have perpetuated a colonial mindset incompatible with justice, healing, or reconciliation. They have frustrated all attempts at reform, infiltrating movements, discrediting whistleblowers, delaying investigations, and burying evidence of wrongdoing. They have ensured that no meaningful change can arise within the system by designing the system to protect itself. In all these oppressions, and in many others too numerous to fully recount, the people have been patient. They have petitioned humbly, protested peacefully, litigated faithfully, and legislated tirelessly. Their petitions have been answered with surveillance. Their protests met with force. Their litigation delayed or denied. Their legislative efforts co-opted or nullified. A system that responds to legitimate grievances with hostility reveals itself not as a representative government but as an unaccountable power structure defending its own existence. Thus, we declare that these abuses form not an accidental pattern but a coherent architecture of domination. And we affirm that any system that destroys the conditions of human flourishing forfeits all claim to legitimacy. We therefore turn to the principles by which a free people must govern themselves, not merely to condemn the old, but to articulate the new. Part 2. Principles of Free Governance. Having laid bare the full measure of our grievances, we now proclaim the principles by which a free society must be constituted, and against which all institutions must be measured. These principles do not emerge from ideology alone nor from the theories of any single generation. They arise from the accumulated wisdom of Republican philosophy, natural law, distributist economics, progressive libertarian ethics, social democratic solidarity, ecological stewardship, and the Cascadian doctrine of sovereign persons articulated by Ghost Liberty, Cypher Kai, and many others whose voices have shaped our awakening. We affirm as self-evident that sovereignty resides first in the individual, and only by voluntary delegation does it ever pass to communities, municipalities, states, or federations. Sovereignty cannot be seized by institutions, it must be granted, and it may be withdrawn. Any government, local, regional, or national, that claims authority without the active, informed, and revocable consent of the governed stands in violation of natural law and cannot command obedience as a matter of right. We affirm that the human person is not a subject, consumer, data point, or resource, but a being endowed with inherent dignity, moral agency, and unalienable rights that no majority may vote away and no government may override. The purpose of governance is not to command individuals but to safeguard their freedom to live, create, cooperate, and flourish. We affirm that rights exist in persons, not permissions, and that governments possess only powers, not rights. Rights precede the state, powers are granted to it. Rights are perpetual, powers are conditional. Rights are natural, powers are artificial. A free society is one in which the state has no authority to trespass upon the autonomy of the individual except where one individual harms another or violates another's rights. All other intrusions are tyranny in embryonic or advanced form. We affirm that liberty and community are not adversaries. A society worthy of the name must cultivate conditions that enable meaningful freedom, access to land, tools, knowledge, health, and opportunity, the ability to form families and communities without economic precarity, and the assurance that no person will be driven into desperation by forces beyond their control. Liberty cannot flourish where insecurity reigns, justice cannot thrive where autonomy is denied. We affirm the distributist principle that productive property should be widely held, not concentrated in private monopolies or bureaucratic empires. The tools by which life is sustained, land, workshops, farms, small businesses, digital infrastructure, and local enterprises, must be diffused throughout communities so that power is likewise diffused. Concentrated property is concentrated power. Concentrated power is incompatible with liberty. We affirm that economics must serve human flourishing, not the reverse. Markets are valuable instruments of coordination but cannot be allowed to degenerate into engines of exploitation. A just economy preserves competition, rewards labor, protects the artisan and the small enterprise, and prevents the emergence of corporate fiefdoms that dominate politics, culture, and daily life. We affirm, following the progressive libertarian tradition, that government may act to secure universal baseline goods, such as education, health, emergency care, environmental protection, and fundamental infrastructure, so long as such provisions do not become mechanisms for dependency or control. Social democracy is legitimate only where it enhances autonomy, it becomes tyranny where it replaces it. We affirm that no person may be coerced into dependency. Any social provision must be structured to preserve personal sovereignty, plural economic models, voluntary participation, and the independence of families and communities. The role of a republic is to ensure the floor beneath the citizen, not to command the ceiling above them. We affirm the ecological principle that a society cannot be free if its land is dying. Stewardship of the natural world is not a partisan issue but a civilizational duty. Cascadia's rivers, forests, mountains, soils, and coasts are the living foundation upon which all future generations depend. Governance must therefore align with bioregional realities, decentralized, ecologically literate, and accountable to watershed-scale communities rather than distant bureaucracies. We affirm that technology must liberate, not enslave. The digital age has unlocked tremendous potential for knowledge, connection, and creativity, but it has also enabled unprecedented forms of surveillance, manipulation, and centralized control. We therefore declare that privacy is not optional, encryption is not negotiable, and digital sovereignty is not a privilege but a right. Open source infrastructure, decentralized networks, and transparent algorithms are essential to a free society. We affirm that the right to self-defense is inherent, not derived from statute. Persons possess the natural authority to defend their bodies, families, communities, and rights against aggression, whether criminal, corporate, or governmental. Any attempt to disarm the populace while arming the state is incompatible with republican liberty. The distributed militia of the people, the peaceful, trained, sovereign citizenry, is the ultimate guardian of freedom. We affirm that pluralism is a civic virtue. A free society must be wide enough to embrace diverse lifestyles, cultures, traditions, beliefs, and moral visions, so long as each respects the equal rights of others. Homogeneity is the ambition of authoritarianism. Diversity of peaceful ways of life is the hallmark of liberty. We affirm the governance principle that subsidiarity and decentralization are essential to preventing the rise of tyranny. Decisions must be made at the most local competent level, within families, neighborhoods, municipalities, and regional communities, before power ascends to more distant institutions. Large-scale governance must exist only to coordinate what cannot be handled locally and must be strictly limited to those tasks. We affirm that transparency is the lifeblood of legitimate authority. No institution may wield public power behind closed doors. Secret courts, classified legislation, undisclosed budgets, covert programs, and unaccountable agencies are incompatible with a free society. A legitimate government must operate in the full light of public scrutiny. We affirm that consent must be active. Silence cannot be construed as assent. Compliance cannot be mistaken for agreement. A governed people must always retain the ability to withdraw consent peacefully, to create new systems voluntarily, and to form associations that better reflect their values. We affirm that politics is not merely the management of force but the cultivation of the common good. A society that secures rights but neglects virtue will decay. A society that demands virtue but denies rights will collapse. Governance must therefore be moral without being moralistic, protective without being paternalistic, empowering without being intrusive. Finally, we affirm that the people themselves are the final guarantors of liberty. No constitution, however well written, no institution, however noble, no tradition, however venerable can substitute for a populace educated, engaged, courageous, self-reliant, and committed to both liberty and justice. Where these principles are upheld, society flourishes. Where they are neglected, society decays. Where they are violated, society becomes unfree. And so, grounded in these principles and compelled by the grievances that preceded them, we now declare the following. Part 3. The Declaration of Separation. We, therefore, the sovereign persons of Cascadia, the free communities of its valleys, mountains, coasts, and forests, the citizens of its towns and cities, the indigenous peoples whose stewardship predates all colonial claims, and all individuals who choose to align themselves with the moral order of liberty and justice, do solemnly, publicly, and irrevocably proclaim our moral and political independence from the institutional order that has betrayed the people. This declaration is not an act of hostility, for we seek no vengeance, no domination, and no violence. It is an act of healing, a reclamation of dignity long suppressed, of sovereignty long denied, and of community long fractured. It is a separation compelled not by hatred but by the recognition that the existing order is incapable of reforming itself and cannot be reconciled with the natural liberty of the individual or the ecological reality of the land. We declare that the political connection between the people and the institutions that have violated their trust is hereby dissolved insofar as those institutions claim legitimacy over us. We release ourselves from obligations imposed without consent, from compacts broken by the state, and from structures that operate to our detriment and contrary to the rights of humanity. We declare that a free Cascadia stands in the moral, political, and natural right vested in every people to organize governance according to principles of liberty, justice, and ecological stewardship. We declare further that we are, and ought to be, free and sovereign in all matters relating to the protection of natural rights, the cultivation of distributive justice, the administration of our commons and bioorigin, the defense of our persons and communities, the maintenance of transparent, accountable governance, the development of local economies and cooperative institutions, the formation of voluntary associations and local autonomies, the establishment of systems of education that cultivate critical thought and civic virtue, the creation of technologies that empower rather than surveil, the safeguarding of privacy, property, and autonomy, the stewardship of forests, waters, wildlife, and lands, the preservation of cultural, ethical, and philosophical diversity. We deny and repudiate all claims of authority that contradict these principles. This separation is not a dissolution of society but its restoration. For the people do not dissolve when governments fail, rather, they reclaim their original authority and reconstitute governance on a foundation worthy of their humanity. We therefore proclaim that the people of Cascadia are absolved from all allegiance to institutions that have broken the covenant of liberty. All political connection between us and those who claim dominion without consent is hereby and henceforth dissolved to the extent required for the restoration of sovereignty. And in its place, we establish anew the foundations of a society grounded in the rights and duties that flow from natural law and communal solidarity. Part 4. The vision of the Cascadian Commonwealth. Having reclaimed our sovereignty and dissolved the illegitimate bonds that once constrained our autonomy, we now articulate the constitutional vision of the free society that shall arise in place of the old order. This vision does not represent the imposition of a new power but the recognition of an ancient truth, that a people, when allowed to govern themselves in accordance with natural law and reciprocal obligation, will generate institutions that nurture liberty, justice, peace, and human flourishing. We declare that the emerging Commonwealth of Cascadia shall be neither an empire nor a colony, neither a corporate fiefdom nor a centralized leviathan, neither a technocratic bureaucracy nor a marketplace of exploitation. It shall be a federation of sovereign persons, families, communities, municipalities, and regions, each possessing meaningful autonomy, each connected through mutual respect, and each bound by a shared commitment to the rights and dignity of all. This Commonwealth shall reject the false dichotomy between rugged individualism and collectivism. Instead, it shall incarnate the principle that liberty and solidarity are mutually reinforcing, that individuals flourish best in healthy communities, and that communities thrive only when their members are sovereign, self-reliant, and secure in their rights. The Commonwealth shall be rooted in the Cascadian ethos, a reverence for the land, a devotion to the integrity of ecosystems, a commitment to decentralization, and an insistence that governance must flow in harmony with the particularities of place. Cascadia is not merely a political vision, it is a bioregional reality, an ecological unity that predates all borders and transcends all administrative divisions. The Commonwealth shall therefore be a bioregional republic, aligned with the watershed logic of nature rather than the abstract geometry of distant authorities. 1. Sovereign persons and inviolable rights. The Commonwealth shall recognize that all authority flows upward from the individual, never downward from institutions. The rights inherent in persons, life, liberty, bodily autonomy, conscience, speech, association, movement, property, privacy, self-defense, due process, and the pursuit of happiness, shall be held sacred and inviolable. No government, assembly, or majority shall possess power to diminish or redefine these rights. Just as no person may be compelled into servitude, surveillance, coercive medical intervention, disarmament, or ideological conformity, the Commonwealth shall prohibit all forms of compelled participation in systems that violate individual sovereignty. Liberty is not a privilege to be granted or withdrawn, it is a permanent quality of personhood. 2. The autonomy of communities. In accordance with the principle of subsidiarity, local communities, villages, towns, neighborhoods, municipalities, shall possess primary authority over their internal affairs, limited only by the requirement that they respect the equal rights of all persons. These communities may adopt distinct cultural, social, or economic practices, organize cooperative institutions, maintain local currencies, and cultivate unique identities without interference from higher levels of governance. Local autonomy shall not be a courtesy but a constitutional guarantee. No distant authority shall impose mandates unrelated to the protection of rights or ecological stewardship. Communities shall govern themselves according to their own customs so long as no person's natural rights are denied. 3. The stewardship of the bioregion. Because Cascadia is defined by its forests, rivers, mountains, and watersheds, the Commonwealth shall treat ecological preservation as a foundational obligation. The health of the land is inseparable from the health of the people. Governance shall therefore be ordered according to bioregional logic rather than arbitrary borders. Watershed councils, ecological commons trusts, regional assemblies of stewards, and citizen bodies devoted to the protection and renewal of ecosystems. This stewardship shall not be centralized environmental authoritarianism but a decentralized guardianship in which individuals, local communities, cooperatives, and regional associations each play a direct role in ecological care. The Commonwealth shall reject the notion that nature is a commodity or an industrial input. Instead, it shall recognize the intrinsic value of the land and the moral imperative to preserve it for generations yet unborn. 4. The economy of shared prosperity. The Commonwealth shall embrace a distributist and progressive libertarian economic order in which productive property is widely distributed, opportunities are accessible to all, and the fruits of labor flow primarily to those who create them. This economy shall encourage small businesses, worker cooperatives, family farms, artisanal trades, community enterprises, mutual aid networks, local markets, decentralized industry, open source technologies, sustainable agriculture, regenerative land stewardship. The Commonwealth shall reject monopolies, corporate feudalism, extractive finance, and rent-seeking institutions that centralize wealth and enslave communities. It shall likewise reject the tyranny of overregulation that stifles innovation, independence, and enterprise. The goal is not to eliminate markets but to humanize them, not to abolish commerce but to decentralize it. Economic freedom shall be tempered by the recognition that no person should be trapped in poverty, prevented from building a livelihood, or denied access to the basic goods necessary for meaningful liberty. A system that guarantees only the freedom to starve is no system of liberty at all. 5. The digital rights of a free people. In the age of surveillance and algorithmic governance, privacy shall be recognized as central to human dignity. The Commonwealth shall guarantee the right to strong encryption, the right to anonymous communication, the right to digital property, the right to transparent algorithms, the right to refuse surveillance, the right to control personal data, the right to build decentralized networks. The digital sphere shall be governed not by corporate oligarchs nor by intrusive agencies but by the people themselves. Technology must serve autonomy, not domination, creativity, not control. 6. The security of the people. The Commonwealth shall affirm the natural and absolute right of all persons to arms, self-defense, community defense, and preparedness against tyranny, crime, and aggression. The people shall not be dependent upon standing armies or militarized police for their safety. Rather, they shall constitute the distributed militia of the free, trained, voluntary, peaceful, and vigilant. No institution shall maintain a monopoly on force. The people must remain the ultimate guardians of the Commonwealth, for history has shown that governments disarm citizens not to protect them but to control them. 7. The transparent and accountable state. Whatever institutions the people consent to form shall be radically transparent. Meetings, budgets, decisions, deliberations, and operations shall be accessible to all. Secret courts, secret budgets, and secret powers shall be prohibited. Officials shall serve under strict term limits, direct recall mechanisms, and ongoing consent requirements. The Commonwealth shall ensure that no office outranks the people, and no authority is shielded from accountability. 8. The culture of liberty and solidarity. The Commonwealth shall cultivate a civic culture rooted in personal responsibility, mutual aid, voluntary cooperation, critical thinking, respect for dissent, diversity of thought and identity, community stewardship, shared prosperity, ecological awareness, the moral obligations of freedom. Education shall be oriented toward developing competent, sovereign citizens capable of self-governance, not obedient subjects conditioned for dependence. The people shall be taught history in full, science without distortion, ethics with depth, and civics with rigor. The purpose of education is liberation, not indoctrination. Part 5. The Covenant of Mutual Guarantee. Therefore, in order to secure these principles against the dangers that have plagued past republics, we, sovereign persons of Cascadia and of all communities aligned with this declaration, do enter into a covenant of mutual guarantee. We pledge to one another to defend the natural rights of all persons, even those whose beliefs differ from our own. To resist coercion, domination, and exploitation wherever they arise. To hold accountable any institution that violates the sovereignty of the people. To preserve the land, waters, and habitats entrusted to our care. To support the economic independence of families and communities. To protect the privacy, autonomy, and dignity of individuals. To maintain the balance between liberty and solidarity. To pass on to future generations a society more just, more free, and more whole than the one we inherited. This covenant stands not as a chain but as a bond of trust, voluntary, mutual, and grounded in the understanding that liberty is sustained only when individuals accept responsibility for their own lives and communities, and when communities nurture the conditions in which individuals may flourish. Part 6. The Closing Proclamation. Having proclaimed our grievances, articulated our principles, and established the covenant by which our new society shall endure, we now speak with one voice, as sovereign individuals united by shared purpose, common aspiration, and moral clarity. We do not stand against a people, nor against any land, nor against the ordinary citizens who have themselves suffered beneath the weight of institutions that no longer serve them. We stand against oppression, against domination, against systemic corruption and the concentration of power in distant hands. We stand for liberty, for justice, for community, for the flourishing of human dignity, and for the harmonious stewardship of the natural world. In making this declaration, we do not turn our backs on humanity, nor retreat from our responsibility to the global community. We remain committed to peace, cooperation, and goodwill among all nations and peoples. But peace cannot be built upon subjugation, cooperation cannot thrive under domination, and goodwill cannot flourish where rights are violated. Our separation therefore stands not as an act of hostility but as an affirmation of universal principles that transcend all borders and political forms. We call upon the nations of the world to recognize the legitimacy of our claim to moral and political independence. We seek peaceful relations, free trade, mutual respect, and diplomatic cooperation. We ask nothing but what all peoples are entitled to: the freedom to determine our own destiny, to govern our own communities, and to live according to our own principles. We call upon those within the territories of Cascadia, and those beyond them, who share our values, who yearn for autonomy, who seek a life of dignity and purpose, who long for a society rooted in liberty, solidarity, and ecological responsibility, to join us in this new beginning. Citizenship in the Commonwealth of Cascadia shall not be determined solely by geography but by commitment to the principles herein declared. It shall be open to all who pledge themselves to the covenant of mutual guarantee and who embrace the responsibilities of sovereign personhood. We call upon the institutions of the old order to reflect upon the causes that have led us to this moment. If they wish to regain legitimacy, let them repent of the injustices detailed herein, dismantle their engines of oppression, relinquish their monopolies on power, and restore the rights of the people. Yet whether they reform or whether they resist, our course is set: we shall no longer live as subjects of powers that do not recognize our sovereignty. We call upon communities throughout Cascadia to begin immediately the work of independence, not through violence or insurrection, but through construction, cooperation, and self-governance. Let households form mutual aid networks. Let neighborhoods create councils. Let towns establish assemblies. Let cooperatives develop local industries. Let educational institutions cultivate the next generation of sovereign citizens. Let communities safeguard their watersheds, forests, and lands. Let people build the infrastructure, digital and physical, by which free societies thrive. We call upon the armed citizens of Cascadia, not in the spirit of aggression, but in the spirit of vigilance, to ensure that no force, foreign or domestic, infringes upon our right to live free. The militia of the people shall remain ever peaceful, ever disciplined, ever respectful of rights, but never passive in the face of tyranny. We call upon artists, writers, philosophers, teachers, scientists, engineers, healers, and all whose work shapes the mind and soul of society, to infuse this new commonwealth with creativity, wisdom, compassion, resilience, and beauty. Let the culture of liberty flourish not only in institutions but in the hearts of the people. We offer this declaration not as an endpoint but as a beginning. The path ahead will be long, demanding, and filled with trials. Freedom has never been won easily nor kept without vigilance. But we proceed with confidence because the principles that guide us are enduring, universal, and harmonized with the nature of human dignity. Let the old order tremble not at our defiance but at its own betrayal of the people. Let it fear not our separation but the example we set, an example of sovereignty reclaimed, of justice restored, of harmony renewed, and of communities flourishing without the chains of centralized domination. Let future generations look back upon this moment not as an act of division, but as a rebirth, a time when the people of Cascadia remembered who they were, reclaimed what was theirs, and forged a path toward a society grounded in liberty, mutual responsibility, ecological stewardship, and distributive justice. And so we conclude with the solemn covenant that has inspired revolutionaries across centuries, that we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our honor, and our sacred commitment, not to war, but to peace, not to destruction, but to construction, not to domination, but to freedom. We pledge ourselves to our children and to their descendants, so that they may inherit a world more just, more free, and more alive than the one we received. We pledge ourselves to the land, which has nourished us and will sustain those who follow. We pledge ourselves to the truth, that no authority can extinguish, no propaganda can obscure, and no tyranny can erase. We pledge ourselves to one another, bound not by coercion but by voluntary and sacred trust. With firm reliance on the principles of natural law, with unwavering faith in the dignity of the human person, and with devotion to the flourishing of the land and all who dwell upon it, we hereby declare that the sovereign persons of Cascadia are, and of right ought to be, a free and self-governing people. This declaration we publish to the world, appealing to the judgment of humanity and the testimony of history, confident that the cause of liberty, once awakened, cannot be extinguished. Thus begins the Commonwealth of Cascadia.